I read Binti Home by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the second story in a trilogy, and I'll be talking about how it relates to the first story. So if you don't want spoilers for that, you should stop listening. This story picks up about a year after the first story. So Binti has been at university with Okoru, the Medus creature, and they have been, doing all the university stuff together. But now it's come to the point where it's kind of like vacation time, or like Binti wants to go back to Earth and get away from the university. And this is kind of motivated by her having panic attacks and feeling changes in her body that she doesn't understand and that she feels scared about. And part of this could be due to the fact that she has been infected, or like her body has been changed by the Medus so like all of her hair has turned into the same kind of tentacles that the Medus jellyfish creatures have. And so she doesn't have like hair on top of her head anymore. She has these tentacles. And she's not sure if there's like other changes happening in her body that are related to this, or if these changes in her body are like something else, or what's going on. And she just feels homesick and scared, and she wants to go home. She's also been having panic attacks related to being the sole survivor of the trip from Earth. And she's been going to therapy because of that, and getting help with that. And so there's kind of a reversal of the original story where Binti was running away from her home culture, leaving the Earth, and her goal and destination was the university. And here immediately, like, all of that is inverted, and she's leaving the university and she wants to go home. She also rides back on the same exact ship that brought her to the university in the first place. And I don't think I talked about it, but the ships are alive, or at least this ship is, which I always think is such a cool idea. It makes so much sense to me. Way more sense than like building something. It just seems like in the future, we should just grow everything that we need. That just makes so much more sense. If we want to get away from, having like a waste culture and stuff like that. I mean, that's literally how nature does it, right? Like the environment, what's one person's waste is another thing's food or whatever. And so there's like, if we could engineer that kind of a situation, just seems like it's ideal. But anyway, she rides back in the same ship. And so even that is kind of parallel in the story. And this is not really helping her mental health state as it relates to like having panic attacks. So she continues to have panic attacks. And in the first story, she would often fall into a kind of meditative state. And she continues to do that in this story to cope with the panic attacks, where she basically does like complicated mathematics in her head. This trance-like state allows her to kind of drop out of the feeling that's happening in her body, and therefore kind of transcend the experience and get herself out of a loop of being traumatized by the PTSD. And so it seems like no matter where Binti goes, she just kind of doesn't fit in. That's a big part of her character and the story, the journey that she's on in this trilogy. She originally left home because of her dreams of going to Umza University. And then when she gets there, she's kind of like a singular kind of freak almost, because she's the only person who can talk to the Medus. She has Medus biology that's growing in her body now. And then she feels like she can't stay there anymore because of that. And now she can't even be on the ship because it's triggering her PTSD response. So poor Binti, no matter what she does, she just can't fit in to the situation. And you can see the theme in the original story about alienation and how alienness it was used continues in this story as well. Binti is just always on the outside of things. But they managed to land safely back in the earth. And so that's an inversion as well. Like she was the sole survivor, but this time everybody survives. And in fact, the ship itself is pregnant, which is such a cool idea too. That, like these ships self perpetuate and that, there's like a lineage to them. I just love that stuff. It's so cool. So it's like not only did nobody die, but new life is being produced. So that inversion continues. And then when she comes back to the landing pad and stuff, her whole family is there to greet her. Everybody is joyful that she's come back. But then there's kind of like a weird political situation because of the Medus coming with her. And so I guess the group that's like in charge of the area or that has like political control of the area are at war with the Medus. And there's like a brief little possible skirmish that almost happens, but Binti kind of like puts an end to it and they're able to get home safely. So again, there's just, there's no violence. I'm just noting that Okorafor is inverting the structure of the first book. And of course, also like that is the name of this book, Home. And so like the whole thing is about coming home, but in coming home, she doesn't fit in very important ways. And so when she comes home, her father has, in a very sweet moment, created a space for the Medus Okwu that is like its native atmosphere and all of that stuff. And so it can comfortably stay in that space and not have to like compromise of being on Earth. It can be comfortable. I think when I talked about the first book, I was referring to Okwu as he, and that I think that's just how I think of it, but also in the text, it talks about like two different voices of Medus who are talking to each other, and Okwu's voice is like lower and the other voice is higher. And so I think I assigned gender to that. But gender is like an important part of this particular story. And the fact that the pronoun that Okorafor chooses for Okwu is it, a genderless pronoun, is, I think, important because that's probably a literal part of their biology is that they don't have sex. And so gender might not be an aspect of their culture at all. Also, the Medus have a kind of collective mind, or their consciousness is shared among all of these different bodies. And so to even think of them in terms of having individual genders or sexualities or maybe even personalities might be an incorrect way to interpret what the Medus are. And so it might not be even useful to talk about in those terms. But I think all of that is on purpose because it's kind of modeling the relationship to gender and sex that is happening in this particular story. But anyway, Okwu is pretty comfortable in Binti's family home thanks to her dad. And then Okwu wants to go off and see water because that's like a big deal in the Medus culture. And there's like there's tons of water on Earth. And so that's a pretty special experience. And for the most part, we don't really get Okwu for the rest of the story because it goes off and does its own thing as it relates to the water. And Binti is busy with other things, and so we just don't see Okwu anymore in the story very much. But she reveals to her parents that she wants to go through a special ritual in their culture that has to do with like growing up. And it's like a purification ritual that young women do, but she's not sure when it's going to happen. And her mother tells her, well, actually, that's going to happen in the morning. And so there's like basically no time to prepare for this. And it seems like Binti believes that doing this ritual will help with the PTSD or whatever she is feeling in her body. It's the purification aspect of it is going to get rid of all of these bad feelings and she'll be getting back to normal. But as she spends time with her family, it seems like there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of hurt feelings about her running away, and she just doesn't fit in at her home. And so that theme of alienation continues. Different members of her family notice that her hair is completely transformed, and they note that nobody treats her badly. There's no abuse in her family, but it's definitely obvious that Binti doesn't feel good about her relationship with her family. She feels that things have changed, and she's having a hard time coping with that change. So in the first book, we find out that Binti has an object that she calls an Nnedi that is some kind of alien technology that's mysterious. It has the ability to hurt the Medus, but it also seems to like translate their language or give that ability to Binti. And she continues to mess around with the Nnedi and try to figure out what's going on with it. But in the course of fooling around with it, she somehow like breaks it or drops it. She has an ability, I didn't talk about this in the first book at all, I think, that to like create electrical charges, or I think she does, if I'm understanding the text right. She can literally seem to generate electricity, and that seems to be like an ability that her people group has, or that something to do with her genius or her prodigy nature. She's just really, really good with electronics and electricity to the point where she can generate electrical fields herself. And this has nothing to do with the Nnedi, but it is something that like allows her to access it. And it seemed to me like she was trying to use that ability on it. And she was in that trance-like state, avoiding her panic attack. But the whole thing gets interrupted. And when it does, the Nnedi falls apart. And so now this object is broken in the same way, like its shape has changed, it's broken. That's how Binti is feeling. And so there's a symbolic resonance between this event and what's going on with her mentally. And at the same time, I think that the Nnedi symbolizes time. Okorafor specifically calls it like a piece of time. And as soon as it breaks, Binti is kind of pulled back in her memory to when she first obtained it in the desert when she was younger. And in this flashback, we see that once again, Binti is running away from home. She feels resentful towards her family. She feels like she doesn't fit in. And she leaves and goes out into the desert by herself. And then she sees like a little flower sticking up out of the sand. And when she digs at it, there's something under the ground there, and she pulls it up, and it's the flower is like growing out of the Nnedi. And then she encounters an old woman, and she realizes that this is actually her grandmother from her father's tribe, and the group of people that her father is from actually live in the desert. They're called the desert people, according to the Himba people that Binti was raised by. So they don't really like have a tribal name is what I mean. They're just like, oh, those are the desert people. As if to say like, those are the homeless people. There's an othering that happens to that community from the Himba where they condescend to them and look down on them. And so Binti is scared that this woman is her grandmother because that confronts her with the fact, and she knew this fact, that she has a kind of hybrid heritage where she's partially from this group of people who are not considered fully human by her culture. And I think that goes back to the Ojize that I talked about in the first story, which continues to be important in this story. But, she covers her face, she covers her hair, and both of those, like all of her skin, really, that would be visible with the Ojize. And those are the identifying factors of this other desert group. They have darker skin, they have bigger, kinkier hair. And so, in a way, covering herself in the Ojize is to literally like kind of paint her way into the culture that she's been raised in, that her mother is from. And now, in addition to that, like she doesn't even have hair on her head anymore. She has the Medus tentacles. And so her hybrid nature is continuing to be emphasized in all these different ways. She doesn't fit in to any of the cultures that she's biologically a part of at this point. She's not a desert person. She's not a Medus. She's not a Himba. She is an alien. She is the most alien character in the story. And so we see the rest of the flashback. Her grandmother tells her to keep the Adan and give it to her father and study it, and that not to worry too much, and that if she ever has any questions, she can come back to the desert people and find out more about her heritage. But Binti's too scared to do that, and she just goes home. And she shows her father, and he's very interested in the object, but, allows her to keep it. And she doesn't really tell him the truth about what happened. So there's something about that whole thing, because he is very upset that he is from these tribes. He's not comfortable with the heritage that he has and how that relates in the Himba culture. So he doesn't like to talk about it, and Binti doesn't want to upset him by telling him what really happened. Then we go back to the present, quote unquote, where the Adan is broken, and Binti sees a figure out of the window that is disturbing and strange, and she realizes it's a kind of supernatural creature called the Night Masquerade, which is really weird because women cannot see the Night Masquerade, only men can. And so this gets back to the queering aspect of gender and sex and the changes in her body that are happening. And this is like very alarming to her. And she doesn't know what it means. And then she's suddenly like captured or kidnapped, I guess, by the desert people, who reveal to her more about her actual heritage and what the origins of the desert people are, and what they call themselves the Zenaria, which she did find that out in the flashback. But they explained to her that that means the golden people, and that the technology that she has comes from this alien group that visited Earth very long time ago, like way before. To me, this seems like tens of thousands of years ago, maybe. And they've maintained the knowledge in their group through an oral tradition, but also through a biological and technological heritage that was infused into them by this alien group. And so the aliens were on their way to the UMSA University that Binti goes to, and they kind of like took a pit stop on the Earth, and they visited the desert because they liked the color of it. And while they were there, they met the ancestors of Binti's people here, and they infused in their bodies a technology that is able to be passed down through the bloodline that lets them communicate with each other remotely through a holographic display that only they can see once they've been kind of initiated into synchronizing their biology with the technology. And that has to be done through a particular ritual that has been handed down once again through the oral tradition. And so this is part of the origin of the feelings in her body that Binti has been having. It's the awakening of this technology and the waiting to see if she's going to activate it or not. And this goes back to what I was saying, I think, about the Medus people having a kind of collective consciousness, if you can call them a people, or maybe they are a person with many appendage bodies, like many nodes on a network, but really the network is the person, so to speak. But anyway, the point being that there's constant communication that is possible between all the nodes on the network. So every body is in contact with every other body, and that's how they exist. And so there's a biological communication network, is the point that I'm making, in the Medus biology. And we come to find out the same thing exists in Binti's body through these golden people aliens. And so her father is able to access this network where he has like a personal holographic display and he can message his mother at any time. But also, are the two networks that exist inside of Binti like interacting with each other? Or is, when the one network is awakened from the desert people heritage, it seems like it amplifies her connection to the Medus, and she suddenly senses Okwu and that Okwu's in trouble. But at the same time, there seems to be some kind of trouble going on with her family back home. And there's like a fire or something is what she senses. And so there's a big climax here at the end that kind of leads into a cliffhanger of like, there's some kind of big danger that's happening to everyone that Binti cares about. And she's only able to hear about it through this biological communication network and not able to, like, she's not there to do anything about it. And so she needs to leave quickly from the desert people and get back home, which again, is like, that is the trajectory of this book. It is about home. It's called Home. And so as much as there's a constant like leaving and returning motion that happens throughout this short book, like even in the flashbacks. And Binti carries around inside of her through her psyche the home that she has and her ambivalent feelings about fitting in. Like, does she fit in? Does she not fit in? She has dreams and hopes that conflict with the desires of her family and her community and their expectations of her. And at the same time, her body is rebelling against what she would want. She doesn't want to see the night masquerade. She wants to be a normal girl. She doesn't want to have this communication network and this connection to the desert people, but she does. And so she's having to learn to reconcile herself with who she really is versus who she would rather be, the easier path, the more fitting in path. And so Okorafor, again, it is leveraging the trope of the alien in science fiction to express something about, I think, early womanhood, about being a teenager. Because Binti is somewhere around 18 or 19, the process of coming into your adulthood, the way that interacts with your family, with the wider community culture that you're a part of, but also the culture that you encounter when you leave that community, and what all of that makes you, the way that you're getting pulled in all these different directions, and the confusion and trauma that can produce in you. But at the same time, like, the incredible power, like, as much as, all of this is very troubling to Binti, she is becoming a very powerful individual, a very special person who has access to all of these different networks simultaneously and is bridging all of these different communities, and is also a special kind of prodigy and genius who is going to be able to create technology that none of these people could create on their own without her. And so there's something special in the way that she's able to connect Umza University to the Himba, to the desert people, to the Medus. And through that networking, she's going to, create something new and different. She is something new and different. And it's just a scary time for her until she can fully step into that role, I think. There's a lot of different ways that Okorafor could have told this story, but I think by leveraging the alien, it's just kind of a brilliant move because it really does feel that way emotionally. And in this case, it literally is that way. And that's just one of the advantages that speculative fiction offers to the writer sometimes, is that they can literalize a metaphor so that the character has to actually live through it. And that, like I talked about before with Darko Suvin, kind of gives us a cognitive estrangement from like, oh yeah, I've never thought of my life in terms of like being an actual alien. But yeah, it does feel that way, doesn't it? And so it kind of peels away what would be invisible, and kind of because it's so normal to us. So like, oh yeah, teenagers are moody, their body is changing, blah, 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 who cares? But when you give them alien tentacles coming out of their head and holographic networks popping up in front of their face, suddenly it's like, oh yeah, I do remember what it was like to become an adult and how confusing that was. And it just makes you kind of reframe everything and somehow brings you back down to earth, oddly enough. So it's just a masterful use of the genre and the tropes within the genre, while also, I think, making them fresh and new, because this isn't just the genius Binti going out into outer space and encountering aliens and using her human genius to dominate them or something like that. We're not telling Edgar Rice Burroughs' story here. This is a totally different kind of thing that's about hybridity, that's about bridging communities. And I think it's something new that Okorafor is blazing a trail for other writers who come behind her.